All right, everyone, welcome to BioWork Module 5, titled Equipment and Utilities. And, starting this module off, I just want to say that I think that the bioprocessing and the manufacturing side of the house, they make things very complicated, and it should not be very complicated at all. These are things that you are going to run across in everyday life, and I hope that I can actually showcase this a little bit throughout this module and throughout this lecture information. So this particular lecture module is going to focus on equipment. Okay, so I think that's common sense. It's like all of the pieces and the parts that make this process work. And then utilities. Well, what are utilities? Utilities are like your house utilities. So all of your water bills and your electric bills and your cable bills that you are paying, those are utilities. And guess what, everybody? The pharmaceutical company and the bioprocessing world also has utilities that they have to pay and that they have to use in order for this process to go forward. So without wasting any more time, I kind of want to dive deep down into the lecture portion of this particular module. And, we're going to start off a little bit slow. And we're going to say, guess what? Okay, everybody, we are talking about the pharmaceutical industry. Oh, well, go figure. You didn't tell me, Tracy. The pharmaceutical industry, isn't that the class that we're in? And my answer is, yeah, it is. So that's kind of where we're starting. So the pharmaceutical industry has what we call actually the highest regulations of any type of laboratory environment and manufacturing environment. They need very precise equipment. They need very precise requirements that they have to follow. They are heavily audited. They have third-party government organizations coming to their site and inspecting everything to make sure things are going the proper way. So we need to talk a little bit about that. But with that mentality, we have to be very particular on all the pieces and the parts that go in to make this consumer product. So quality is a very magic word that the pharmaceutical industry uses. We have to make sure that the products that we are making is actually very high quality. Now, how we get to that product, those are different stories. We can use biologics, and that's kind of the purpose of the bioprocessing realm. We can use biologics to get to that finished final product, or we can use a little bit of chemistry-driven types of reactions and refluxing and distillation and purification in order to get to that quality product. Well, that's not the world of bioprocessing in a way. That's more of a different type of just chemical-driven route. We are not relying on any biologics to do the work for us. So there's a couple of different paths that we can take, but whichever path that is, the pharma industry as a whole has the most precise requirements that they have to follow and that they have to stay stringent to. And it's our job as employees to make sure that we deal with that and that we follow those and that we have some insight about what's going on under that roof, what's going on in that big mixing vat, what's going on in all of the stainless steel piping and tubing that's running through the ceilings. We got to figure out what all of those are and the purpose of those before we go a little bit further. All right. So a little bit of review maybe. GMP is good manufacturing practices. That's what GMP stands for. Well, guess what, folks? We're in manufacturing world. Hello. So GMP should be kind of directed to us because we are being hired to manufacture a product. So we want to manufacture it good. So that's good manufacturing, and the P is practices. So these are things that we should be following as we are working within a company, and things that the company should follow if they want to make sure that they are doing things the right way. So GMP is everywhere. I can't get away from it. It's every little nook, it's every little cranny, it's every little corner that we will turn around and kind of come in contact with. So for pharma and biotech manufacturers, okay, here's where maybe a little bit of the confusion is going to be. This up here is talking about equipment, because the title of this lecture is Equipment and Utilities. Well, what are utilities, Tracy? Well, let me tell you what utilities are. Utilities is all of the electricity that the company might use. That's a utility. It's all of the water that that company might use. That's a utility. It's a utility bill. I mean, isn't that what you call it when you got to force out those checks and those credit card payments because you just were we're landed with a $500 energy bill that you're going to have to pay. Well, okay, manufacturing's the same way. We have utilities and we've got to use those utilities in order to make these products. So utilities need to be scrutinized and they need to go under a scalpel because we have to make sure that the utilities, when we use them, are going to be the best utilities that are at our disposal for most of our steps that we take in biomanufacturing. Now, not all utilities have to be that way, but anything that's coming in contact with the manufacturing side of that particular product, we have to make sure, the company has to make sure that these are very high quality utilities that we are using. Very, very important. All right. So we're going to sling out some terms like we most of the time do. And these terms are going to be called, number 1, an input, and number 2, an output, and number 3, processes. So we need to talk about the differences between these. And an input is anything that you are putting into the manufacturing of that product. Hello, doesn't that make sense? Input, putting them in. All right, so an input are all of the raw ingredients maybe. So everything that is needed in order to make that product, of course, those are going to be inputs. But what a lot of people kind of forget, another type of input that's out there are your utilities. Those are also inputs. So the air that the company might be using, the water, the electric, the steam, any of those things that are coming in contact with the product that is trying to be manufactured, those are inputs as well. So that is a whole realm that people ignore, but that input is sometimes as important as what we call the raw ingredients to make that thing work. The output, yes, the output is the finished product. Absolutely, that's what that is. So what we are trying to make is going to be made. We cross our fingers and we hope, because if it does, we get paid. Yeah, we get a paycheck. All right, so if the products are made, that's great. That is an output. But the other part of the story that people seem to forget is that output is also waste. So waste is another output. That is something that is getting generated from the manufacturing process. Okay, that is something that we have to kind of follow through. We have to identify it. We have to know that it's there, because that waste, even though I might not want it and the company might not want it, it is getting generated. It is getting made. So by definition, that is also an output. And that waste has to be taken care of. So where does it go? How do we handle it? Do we just dump it down into the Cape Fear River? I mean, that's kind of the things that we've got to think about when we look at this particular output, because it is an output. So outputs are not just the products that we're trying to target. Outputs are anything that is getting spit out from the end result of the process that we have just started or that we have just finished. Finally, processes are another term, and processes are really just the steps. They call them, activities that transform or work on materials. Okay, well, processes are just the steps that it took in order to get there. So I'm taking inputs into the system. I'm maybe mixing and blending and fermenting those inputs together. And then those inputs, we have to take certain steps. Those steps have to be followed in order to make a particular type of product. Those steps are the processes. That's the formal term that we use for that. So we follow processes in order to make the final product. And that final product is termed an output, but everything else that is made is actually termed an output as well. So all process steps are included in what we call a process document. And companies hire what we call process technicians, right? So a process technician would be someone whose job it is to follow processes as they are written on a sheet of paper, as they are made by the company, to make sure that those steps are actually taken and performed and finished and completed the proper way. All right, so what I like to do is every now and then, step back and let's just take a look at our common everyday life. There you go. Here's a process, right? This process is making a cake, and I've got some inputs up at the top. Hello, inputs are all of the ingredients that are needed in order to make a product. Okay, well, here are the inputs. It is a cup of water, it is a stick of butter, and it's 3 eggs. That is an input, okay? Well, there's other things that are inputs here too. Hello, it says heat an oven to 350 degrees. There's going to be some heat involved. There's going to be some electricity involved, because without electricity, my oven doesn't work if I'm using the oven in my house. Or maybe you're on a gas range, and if you're in a gas range, ooh, fancy you, but guess what? You're going to have some type of heat or outside energy source in order to bake this cake. So that is an input, just as the butter and the eggs and the water. So we've got some inputs that happen in the beginning, and then out the other end, plop, out goes a cake, and that cake is an output. So that is something that we have made. That's something that we're interested in. That's why we did this anyway. That is the output of interest. But you know, there's other outputs here too. What are some of those other outputs? Well, okay, you cracked some eggs, but you didn't use the whole egg. So guess what? You've got waste. And that waste are eggshells. And those eggshells are an output, because that was something that happened at the end of this process. What do you do with those eggshells? Where do they go? Do they go in your trash can? Do they go in your garbage disposal? I hope not. Do they go outside and you crunch them up and you put them in your garden? I don't know what kind of fancy things that you do with the eggshells, but that is a waste product that we're not interested in, and that waste product is an output from this process, right? The same thing happens with the butter. The butter on the inside is what we use. That is our input. The wrapping around the butter, though, that is waste. We do not want that. What do we do with that waste? That is kind of a byproduct that's happening after the mess here. And then our cup of water, right? Okay, well, that's an input. Great, good job. How do we get rid of that if we got too much of it? Well, I think you know the answer to that. So all of the steps that you see here, these are the process steps. That's what those are. So you are going to be blending. You are going to be mixing. You're going to make sure that everything looks homogenized, which means, okay, homogenized. Is that a new word for you? Okay, well, homo and then G-E-N, homogeneous. Well, homogeneous means it looks the same from top to bottom. That's what that means. So we're going to have to homogenize the samples, make sure that everything looks pretty good. We are going to let it do its thing, let it ferment, let it churn, let it bubble, let it burp. I mean, I don't know, okay? Different things have different processes that they have to go through. Either way, these are the process steps. So I'm going to heat it. I'm going to pour them into the proper containers. I'm going to bake it. And then after a certain amount of time, I'm going to take it out. And when I take it out, I hope that I end up with a very good quality product. And that quality product, I hope, is that chocolate cake or whatever I decided to bake in this example. But also in the world of biomanufacturing, whatever type of product that the company has to make. We hope that that is good quality as well. So as you can imagine, there's going to be some cleanup. What do I do with all the trash? How do I wash the bowls once I get finished mixing them? What goes on? Where do I put them? What kind of soap do I use in order to wash those bowls with? How do I clean off the countertops? Because I probably made a mess when I went through these process steps. So all of that is also going to be part of the process that begins to take place. We got to know how to clean it up, how to sterilize it, how to clean off my countertops. So that way my raw eggs don't start contaminating everything else that it comes in contact with. Well, with that said, there is going to be some terms, and I think some of the terms we've cleared up already, and some of the terms I've not made it to yet, but we'll talk about them now. An input, I think you have a better idea of what these are. So an input are ingredients or utilities that are required in order to make a product. The outputs are everything that happens after the manufacturing. So for instance, the output would be my active pharmaceutical ingredient maybe. And that is what we would call the molecule of interest or the target molecule, all right? Inputs are all of the raw materials. That's what that's called, all right? Raw materials. There we go. Processes are just the steps that are needed in order to make that process happen. And then we talked a little bit about waste, not formally, but I've kind of mentioned it, right? You know that. I mean, look at our cake. We generated so much waste. We're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to throw it away. We're going to have to clean up after ourselves. So what goes on here? So that is a waste stream. So a waste stream is this idea of everything that I don't want. Where does it go, right? So how do we process that? How do we get it out of the manufacturing facility? Where does it end up? How do we store it? How do we dispose of it? Do we need to do anything else with it before we dump it or get rid of it in some form or fashion? Batch process. Well, okay, what is a batch? Well, a batch is just a large portion of that particular drug product, or in my example, a cake. That is a batch, right? When I read these directions off the back of a cake box, that is going to make one cake. One cake. That one cake process is going to be called a batch because that one process made one cake and one cake only. So that is a batch of, definition-wise, a batch of cake, okay? If I wanted to do another batch, that's great, I can, but I'm going to go back and I'm going to start off with a new cup of water, a new stick of butter, and 3 more eggs. And then I'm going to crack those. I'm going to mix all of those into a bowl. I'm going to pour that into a pan, and I'm going to bake that. And that will be my second round, and that is my second batch. That is what a batch process is all about. All right. Next up is a continuous process. So continuous basically just means it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, and there's no really stopping it in between. So I want you to think of maybe like continuous process. Since we're talking about food, and since I'm maybe making you hungry with chocolate cakes, yum yum, then let's talk about cookies, right? So if I'm working for a cookie factory, I'll probably have the big old tons of dough that's coming in. Cookie dough, right? Who knows what they are? And they're just dumping that down into the little squirter that's squirting out the little cookie shapes, and it's just putting them and plopping them onto a conveyor belt. That is a continuous process, right? Nothing really is stopping. Nothing has to be reset. It just constantly pumps out cookie after cookie after cookie after cookie. That is a continuous process, right? So as long as the vat that holds the dough is filled, then the process of taking that dough and squirting it out into individual cookies for them to be baked and then packaged later on down the manufacturing line, that is a continuous process. As long as it stays filled, it's going to keep squirting those cookies out left and right. A semi-continuous process actually allows you to control the batch. It is not what we call defined, okay? So a batch, if it is a defined batch, would be like, hey, every time we do this process, we're going to end up with 1,000 of these tablets. Or 1,000 of these vaccines. Okay, well, that is a defined number, and that defined number is more traditionally a batch process. That's what that is. So a semi-continuous process is like, well, okay, we don't necessarily have to define it. We've got a little bit of freedom and wiggle room on determining like how much do we want to make. Maybe we don't want to make 1,000 of them every single time we do the batch. Maybe we want to scale that down. Maybe we want to scale that up depending on the order that is coming into the company or their needs as a company. So whichever the case is, that is what we would deem as a semi-continuous process. It is something that we've got control of, and it's something that we can go in and adjust some of the inputs in order to figure out how much output is going to be needed by the manufacturing side of the house. All right. So those are some pretty important terms. Don't say I didn't teach you anything, because I hope that I just did. So the definition of an output, an input, a process, a waste, a batch process, a continuing process, and a semi-continuous process. All right. So in the next video, we're going to pick up, and if you're following with our BioWork manual, kind of our lecture book, if you want to call that, we will be starting section 5.2. So I just gave you a very quick introduction to the Module 5, and particularly 5.1. And again, it is the whole idea of equipment and utilities. That is what this is about. So, in the upcoming lecture videos, you're going to see us focus on specific pieces of equipment that allows us to do our job. And then you're going to look at some utilities that we need to talk about as well, like electricity and water and so forth, and maybe some slight differences or things that maybe you did not know goes on as far as the utilities go. Like, can we just take water from Cape Fear Public Utility Authority and just use it for whatever we want to use it for? Well, guess what? The answer is no, you can't. So we need to talk about those. So in the upcoming videos, we'll flesh out some more of this information, and we'll start off in section 5.2 if you're following me with your book. If not, just sit back and listen and take notes. I think what I give you is going to be good enough.